You know, if you thought that the Russian hacking was sexy, you should see how sexy the Ukrainian hacking is. Apparently, we get closer to the actual truth when they start sanctioning Ukrainians now that were allegedly involved with presidential malfeasance. Now, they won't tell you which malfeased president, right? Because we're in this situation where the new president hasn't sworn in. But for some reason, despite the fact he hasn't taken the oath of office and sworn to uphold the Constitution of the United States as president, he's allowed to have all of this other access and confirm all of these other deals and place hedges as part of the hedge fund everybody knows his living son runs in connection with all of these benchmarks coming up that totally repudiate anything presidential about his predecessor and yet don't really disclose how what he's doing has been done outside of confirmation that he's operating under his oath of office. It's one of those areas. It's a little different than the whole lame duck session. Nobody's ever talked about this. You know, there's been some people that have said that when a president comes into office, his first 100 days are the primary political capital he has to work with in his campaign. And he has the first year where he has a lot of momentum. His second year can be pretty challenging. And then he has a little bit of a chance during the third year, which is usually when he's gearing up for his re-election campaign. And the fourth year, because of the election, can very much be very significant in terms of challenging him. Returning, not returning. What is he able to accomplish in that fourth year while he's campaigning for re-election, just in case he doesn't actually win? And then the next person to come in comes in on what? See, this is what they didn't tell us about Donald Trump coming in. That when Donald Trump came in, he was operating with the end of the Obama administration. The first year a president is in office, he has his own political capital. But he's bringing his political capital into the White House on the coattails of whoever just left. And the first year budget he works with is the last year budget of the predecessor. So if the predecessor has been up to no good, guess what? You come in, and I don't know, maybe a couple months into your term, they say, excuse me, we don't have budgetary authority to get through the summer unless we do something emergency now to get us through the summer so that we can have a budget in time for next year. That actually happened. That actually happened to a president. Now, while the election results were contested, I contend every election result since 2008 is contested. But what do I know? What do I know? Because now that we're sanctioning Ukrainians, perhaps now the real story can come out, which is who has value and who gets away with what when it comes to politics. When I was young, before I was old enough to run for Congress, I was a newspaper editor. And I did a 4-part series and had another part sometime later. The first 4 parts were on domestic prostitution and sex trafficking matters. Around this time, there was a case in Chicago. This case ended up actually being referenced at some point around that time and then later in a congressional hearing on money laundering. It was a case of a man who was from the former Soviet Union, who at that time was importing women, mostly from Latvia, to work in strip clubs around the Chicago area. These women were kept in hotels, and their passports were taken from them, and they would have to do special favors for certain gentlemen callers. In exchange, they might get, $20? But they weren't allowed to leave unless he let them. They weren't allowed to meet with anybody else. There were stories of how some of these women would try to escape, or if they were bad, they would be returned. There was a couple of stories of how some of the women would find a way to get away. And they would go and try to talk to law enforcement, and they would try to get some assistance. And usually what would happen is if they got arrested, they'd get deported. And when they got deported, they'd get to the airport, and right at the airport, the traffickers would pick them back up and just send them back somewhere else. There wasn't really any way to get out of it, was there? Even if you're able to flee or get out of town, as soon as you get to the new town, there's some boy to pick you up. It's called sex trafficking. Now, at this time, there had been legislation that was going on. There was supposed to be an uproar, outcry about this situation. But it wasn't just women from the former Soviet Union. They also were engaging women that were working in agricultural jobs in acts of sex trafficking. There were all kinds of different situations, means by which people would use women specifically, cut off their means of any kind of alternative to making a livelihood and supporting themselves, threaten their families, sometimes even murdering members of their families, stealing their passports, intentionally engaging them in drug use until they became addicted to drugs so that the need for the drug would outweigh any urge or any opportunity for them to escape. How many of them lived? What happened to these women? What happened to these women from the late 1990s, early 2000s that were engaged in these sex trafficking syndicates and then got away? Do we know who any of them are? Are they allowed to talk about their experiences? Are they alive? Do we care? Or are we pissed because when we talk about sex trafficking, what that does is give bad PR to sex work? It's a very legitimate question. Now, for whatever reason, this sanction today has cut off some sort of current that somebody was running concurrent to my livelihood. You know, if at any time somebody had been honest instead of being deceptive and literally trying to steal my life to give themselves political risk insurance that they apparently didn't earn on their own, that would have been honest. But we're supposed to wear masks to demonstrate our compliance. This is an email I wrote myself today. It is completely unacceptable that I could be even a professional dominatrix setting up black ops for future presidents as long as I accepted the war crimes that are Medicare for all. But that was not what it was it? Let me put this in writing. Why did I pursue a short time as a professional dominatrix? A, do you know how many beautiful, brilliant young women that did not come from troubled family backgrounds discussed sex work as a liberating option for their professional lives at that time? Too many. Usually they had progressive, if not radical, political backgrounds. Most identified as queer. They could be queer as part of their personal lifestyle preference, but that did not impact the way they engaged as sex workers. And there were way too many men, including married men, who had no problem soliciting that sex worker, even when he had an esteemed job. I purport that he thought he could solicit the sex worker and get away with it without it impacting his professional life or aspirations, but she was supposed to be assigned to the margins, maybe a subculture like the LGBTQ community, where she went to bars in gentrified neighborhoods that he and his business partners intended to redevelop at some point down the road. B, I was confused about the racialized implications of this, as well as the class implications. I did not believe that someone who came from a poor or below working class family had the same ideals about politics that those in my peer group at the time did. How many young women who were not able to graduate college thought this is not as important as how many young women who did graduate college thought it was an area for research. The college graduated women would dally with the politics, but would they actually permit themselves to consider as a professional the women they knew were involved in sex work? C, what motivated men to solicit women for sex? Ultimately, that was the major interest. Why would a man spend money and time paying for sex, especially if he was the kind of man who could afford to pay for a dominatrix? Why would he need to pay for it? There was something about the power dynamic of paying for that experience in a specific spatial context. Even if he called you and you went to his place, there was a power in the payment of the money, regardless of what she did. Let me ask you a question. If he pays for the encounter, does that mean he owns the experience? You cannot own the context of an encounter with a woman in the same way if you do not pay for it, can you? Even if she consents and he consents, it is the payment of the money that is the power dynamic. D, what kind of men pay $400 an hour for fantasy role play that does not even involve sex? I mean, they are not technically breaking the law. And they don't just want to get off. There is something about the pageantry and the role set up. I had said that part of it was to help pay for my sister who had a debt. I think that means is that they were already setting up black ops accounts involving porn on me and my sister. She had children, I did not. Who was my sister? Should I do psychological profiles on the men who I understood solicited dominatrices in the Chicagoland area between 2002 and 2004? I did not feel at the time there was an ethical problem with it. Is that a result of my upbringing? Was I concerned that it might impair what I could do later? Again, the question was, what sort of men solicit a woman as a professional dominatrix? Where do they go? What do they do 10 years later? 20 years later? Does she get to go to the same places? Outside of the power play and the role play, he is not a submissive. What is she outside of the power play and the role play? Invisible? A criminal? Your boy's pension kickback down the pipeline? A Russian hacker? A banker? A president? Disabled? Classified? They're going to have to unseal everything they did anyway. How many seals along are we? You're not letting that son of a bitch rape the entire country and the world and remand me to obscurity just because I did not do the same thing for free for his favored presidential candidates. Who got his ISIS options? See, that's the thing. Confidential. You took my life and you threw it all over the goddamn fucking planet. In role play scenarios somebody else stepped into poorly. Now, one could say, I did what I did because I was going undercover.